Do you want me to do an introduction for you to begin?
Oh,
Or?
no, it's fine. I can, yeah. Unless there's something you want to say about.
I mean, I just admire your work, and I'm glad that you're on here. And you've recently taken a leap from working in education, both as a teacher and a curriculum developer, to starting your own organization. And just really inspiring work, and we're glad to have you on. So,
Oh, thank you so much, Emily. And I'm just really honored to be here. I've never done this, especially in an online community. So this is new for me. But I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, I used to teach for 16 years. I was in the Chicago area for half of it, and then the other half I was in the Bay Area, which is where I still am today. I'm in San Francisco. And I recently founded a business organization called Yuri with a friend of mine, and we strive to create understanding between diverse communities and inclusion, confronting dominant narratives of society by teaching and creating educational resources through an Asian American lens. So a lot of what I'm talking about today is basically about my experience as an Asian American teacher. And yeah, so I hope this is all helpful for you. And some of you may recognize the places I talk about because a couple of you are from Chicago, so this is great. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. Yeah. So, so what I wanted to do was start by telling you a couple of stories about some students that I know, and I actually wrote about it. I'm a writer also, so I'm just going to read these two stories to you. So the first story is about a Cambodian high school boy, and he's from Chicago, and he showed his tremendous potential on the days he decided to show up to class. He wasn't always there because the only place he felt a sense of belonging was with the gang he joined. His parents worked day and night, and they didn't have time to push him to get a good education. And they fled from Cambodia as refugees during the aftermath of the Vietnam War and the genocide enacted by dictator Pol Pot. His teacher tried to help him by encouraging him about his potential. One day she asked him about his interests and what he wished he could do. He said he had always wanted to learn the piano. She perked up and hatched a plan to keep him from gangbanging after school. She told him that she played piano when she was his age and would be happy to give him lessons after school. The plan worked for a while, where he started coming to class for several days in a row so he could get his piano lesson after school. But unfortunately, the lessons weren't enough, so he fell back to his old patterns. So that's the first student, and these are real people. So the other story is about a Taiwanese American girl who grew up in a suburb of Long Island that was mostly Irish and Italian. By the time she went to high school, she could count the number of Asian kids on her hand. All throughout her schooling, she never learned about anyone who looked like her, nor did she learn about celebrating cultural differences. Instead, she witnessed her brother getting teased mercilessly for being a chink when he was 6 and she was 7. When she arrived at school, she received similar treatment, hearing all these terrible jokes about Chinese and Japanese people having dirty knees, watching kids exaggerate her slanted eyes with their fingers on their own. She didn't know that was racism because no one taught it to her at home or school. She learned quickly that her cultural differences were weird when she told her friends about her mom using rice as paste for her projects, and they said, ew. Thus, she kept all the different parts of her heritage to herself and tried to look and sound like people around her. She even tried to perm her hair so her stick-straight hair wouldn't stand out. She didn't want to seem uncool for fear of being left out and excluded. Despite feeling like she didn't really belong, she was curious about her culture and history at times, and did a history paper on Asian immigration in high school. So those are the two stories. And actually the first story is a student that I taught when I was a Chicago public school teacher. And I was at Roosevelt High School, for those of you in Chicago. And I'll tell you a little bit more about him later on. And then the second student was actually me. So That was my story as a student. And it's a really, yeah, it's a really interesting story that I tell all the time, and just about how I really didn't have a sense of my cultural identity at all in school. I didn't want to be known as different. I felt a sense of loss, like I wasn't seen at all. I didn't feel any sort of belonging whatsoever, and a lack of worth. And on the outside, I may have seemed really like getting along with people and okay, but on the inside, things were really difficult for me. And it was only until I went to college that things changed for me. And I just had this sort of sense of like, well, if I never learned about myself, if people like me weren't worthy enough to be taught about, then why would I be worthy as a person in terms of my culture? Why is that? It's not important. Shouldn't know about it. And so basically, like, the consequences of all of this is that I assimilated so hard in school, and I'm sure you've seen students like this. I wanted to be someone like me, someone else, and everyone around me was white, so I wanted to be white. Basically, it made me look through the eyes of other people because I wanted to be them. It made me look through the eyes of the oppressor, who usually looks at Asians as a more of a subservient, lesser than person. And I just had some self-hatred around that. And I still see that for sure, in students and my own family. Um, and it was even so bad that when I went to college, my roommate, ironically, was Asian, and we were good friends. And so, we'd hang out, and a lot of her, I think most of her friends were all Asian. And I just felt so uncomfortable. And I mean, to the point that I asked her one day, can we hang out with non-Asian people? And I mean, that's how assimilated I was. And I mean, even actually another story that I always tell people in high school, about how my friends would tell me sometimes how they would forget that I'm actually Asian. And I remember being so happy when I was in high school. I'm like, yes, I'm doing it. I'm blending in. It's all great and everything. But there was always this curiosity in me. And so when I did go to school, I went to Northwestern. I joined some student organizations. I joined some Asian American student organizations, and I started understanding the culture and feeling more comfortable. And then I even took a class, because there were no Asian American studies classes. They had things called student organized seminars. And so some fellow students taught this class called the Asian American Experience. And that's when I got to learn about history and stereotyping and all of those things that I never learned at all, ever. And the one person that I learned about that was so pivotal for me is this man called Vincent Chin. And wonder if any of you know who Vincent Chin was? Okay, so Vincent Chin, he died. There was a brutal hate crime inflicted on him when he was about to get married, actually in his 20s in the 1980s. And during that time in the 1980s, the U.S. had really pretty bad negative relationship with Japan because of the economy. I don't know if you remember, like, in the news, that people would be bashing cars made by Japan, like Hondas and Toyotas and all of that, because their auto industry was doing so well and the American auto industry was plummeting. And there were all sorts of trade issues. US policies weren't, very nice, favorable towards Japan. And so, people were doing all sorts of violence against anything Japanese, and with people too. And Vincent Chin, he's not Japanese American, he's Chinese American, but he went to a bar, and these guys that were there, not Asian, tormented him and basically beat him to death. And they were, I think they were given like probation or like very little jail time. And there was a documentary that was made about this. And so when I saw this is a very pivotal documentary for a lot of Asian American students to come into their identity. And that was also for me a moment of like, wow, so I am different. And, not only am I culturally different, but that can be a negative factor for me. And racism can happen to me or to other people of my race because of being culturally different. And that was mind blowing for me, as someone who assimilated and thought I was white for so long. Um, I remember, Asian American friends questioning me and saying things like, Frida, think about a time, have you ever been discriminated? And I said, no, I've never been discriminated, never ever. I didn't think about my school experiences with people like making fun of me that way and all sorts of things like that. Um, yeah, so that was really pivotal for me. And basically it led me to become a leader of an Asian American student organization on campus. And then I went to a conference and I learned about Asian American studies as an academic field. And I was completely blown away. Like, why do all of these universities around the country have this? They even have classes at least on campus, and Northwestern had zero. That students had to create their own classes to learn about themselves. And so I led this movement. I organized a committee of students. We did petitions and had forums, and then eventually then we had a rally, and it turned into a hunger strike. And basically the Asian American Studies program was finally founded. That was 25 years ago, and now there's, you can get a major in this field, which is incredible. Yeah. So and so that was a huge moment for me, and it really helped me find my voice. And I just thought to myself, like, God, it took me more than 20 years to figure out who the hell I am, you know? And maybe if I got an education earlier in my schooling, like in kindergarten or something, I would have had more the sense of my identity and who I am, and not be so mixed up and confused throughout my whole like educational life. And so I saw a flyer on campus for the Multicultural Alliance, and I decided it was about becoming a teacher at an independent school. And so I did that. And that's how I became a teacher. And so my first teaching experience was at Lake Forest Academy. So those of you in the Chicago area should know that area pretty well. Lake Forest is it's a very interesting place. It's like 45 minutes away from Chicago, super homogenous, Anglo white, and just very wealthy. Like, you have CEOs of airline companies there and things like that. So Lake Forest Academy was it's a boarding school. It's on this like old millionaire's estate, and so you have the locals from the Lake Forest area, really wealthy kids, and then you have other kids that are boarded in who are not as wealthy or might have had like um, economic help getting into school, financial aid, and then you have kids from Chicago because they wanted to diversify the school a little bit. And then you have this English language academy also on campus, which was really interesting, where kids from around the world, mainly from South America, Asia, and the Middle East, would come to learn English. And so you just have this whole dynamic of different cultures and economic status and whatever. And when I was there, and actually, I should say, in general, when I became a teacher, a big part of my impetus to becoming a teacher and what I did in all of my teaching experiences was to bring in diversity initiatives to schools. And so part of my job at Lake Forest Academy through the Multicultural Alliance was to do that, as well as to just be there as a person of color. I was one out of 2 or 3 teachers, and I was the only only Asian American teacher. And so I was the diversity coordinator there. I started a teacher committee. I started a student club, and through all of those entities, we did like a massive like implementation of all sorts of programming. Like, we had a diversity symposium where other schools came there to talk about issues. We had assemblies for every Heritage Month. We had after school events, all sorts of things never ever happened before at the school. So I definitely got some pushback. Students were uncomfortable. They wrote about it in the school newspaper. I had teachers coming up to me. I still remember this math teacher. He's pretty elderly, and he came up to me. I was talking about Native Americans or something at the faculty meeting, and he's like, well, I'm a Native American, and he's Irish. And I said, yeah, but you weren't here originally. I had to explain it to him. So it was just really interesting dynamic. And in the English Language Academy, I think Emily saw me tweet about this. These directors were so removed from like the students that they were teaching and that they brought in. They didn't recognize the students' cultures at all. They didn't have any sort of celebratory way of like integrating them into the school. They called the Asian students Oriental. And so a lot of these kids, they felt kind of displaced. And I remember a lot of the Asian students would come to me, and because they were just so happy to see an Asian American adult, and would tell me about their discomfort, and they were just happy to be around me. So I was happy to be there and to support that. And then I moved on to teach in Chicago, where I also implemented some new programming too. I did continue International Night, which was there already, and this is a super diverse school of Latinos, Blacks, people from Serbia and Bosnia, North Africa, so many languages at the school. And the Asian American population was pretty large. It was about 15%. And so students asked me to be a sponsor of the Asian Club, and I started the Asian American Heritage Month Assembly. Of course, that is where the Cambodian boy was, the student that I taught. And he wasn't the only one from that experience. There were many Southeast Asian American students of parents who were refugees from the Vietnam War or Pol Pot, and they did not do well in school. They were truant half the time. And I tried to help all of them, of course, as a teacher. And it was really difficult. I had more than 150 students. I was able to make a connection with this Cambodian boy. And he, I helped him for a while, but it was just so hard to sustain. I mean, I'm just this teacher, this one teacher in his life that sees him for a few hours. And it was, I was sad that I couldn't make a bigger impact with him and a lot of other students that I had. And I know that's why Emily does this work, which is so amazing, I wish I had this when I was in Chicago, because I was under a lot of stress for sure. What's interesting about a lot of the Southeast Asian experience is that they're not really seen in educational policymaking. I think more so maybe today and maybe in certain regions, and maybe in California, for example, in LA. But for the most part, education policies don't see these Asian Americans. They see me. What I lived was the model minority myth, which I don't know if any of you know about the model minority myth, which is basically you assimilate to death because you want to show that you are as American as possible and that you are excelling as possible, so that you blend in well and racism won't ever happen to you, and everything will be gravy. And that is something actually my parents like implemented in me too, and they didn't know what they were doing, but that's just part of it. And so, that you definitely, with Asian American students, you see these two sides. And of course, there's a lot in between of like Asian Americans who are completely marginalized and not doing well in school and don't have that support. And students like me who are doing well on the outside, but on the inside is another story. And I know I looked up these rates online about suicide rates among Asian American kids in college. And I remember when I was at Northwestern, I would hear about some kids in my dorm committing suicide, Asian American students. And I was just like, what's going on? And I know it's because they feel this immense pressure, this academic pressure to like be the very best, and if they can't, then that's what happens, you know. And their rate is kind of high. I think it's like the 8th largest reason why Asian Americans die from suicide. I saw on my phone. Anyway, I can't find it. But in the nation, I think it's 11th. So you know, it's a pretty telling number, I think. A lot of pressures. And yeah, and just talking about traumatic histories in general, not only with the Southeast Asian experience, but even going back to World War II, the Japanese American experience. And you know, I used to work at the Fred T. Korematsu Institute in San Francisco, where we taught about the Japanese American experience, you know, during World War II, how about 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent were forcibly removed from their homes without due process. They were forced to be in prison during World War II. None of them were ever found guilty. But you know, from my work at the Korematsu Institute, I learned a lot, and I met a lot of people who went through these traumatic experiences, who were even babies, or and still felt that trauma because you know, they saw it in their parents, or you know, and a thing with a lot of these families, that it wasn't until recent decades that people actually talked about it. And I'm sure with all sorts of trauma, with like Southeast Asian refugees, they don't talk about it. They don't. It's silenced. And so I think there's always a sense of absence of like, what's going on? Why are my grandparents so sad? You know, like even for Japanese American kids who weren't part of that experience, but they just saw their relatives, and what there was something wrong, but they didn't know what it was. And so there's definitely that also with the legacy of trauma, even though they weren't in those experiences. And through that work, I saw this documentary, which was amazing, called Relocation Arkansas. And it talks about a guy who's, I think he's like in his 30s or 40s now, and how he, you know, had a similar experience as me, didn't want to be Japanese or Asian or whatever, because, you know, you don't want to be imprisoned again for being different. And it showed how he kind of came to terms with his mother's experience being imprisoned, and you just see this reconciliation happening with his own identity and with his family. So it's interesting to see that it just keeps continuing down the line for generations. And I think I've heard, and maybe Emily told me this, that, you know, generation lives in families for at least 7 generations. So that's another experience of Asian Americans in schooling. And then there's also a more recent one, would be how Asian Americans are impacted in their schooling is through, you know, post 9/11, where, you know, I'm sure you see this constantly still all through the news, is all the backlash, against South Asians, Middle Eastern Americans, because they seem like they might be a terrorist because of our US war on terror policies. And yeah, on a side note, I'm kind of scared about what's going to happen to our country. It's a very dark times right now. And yeah, so so a lot of those students, there's been a lot of hate crimes too against students of that background. And yeah, I'm sure that people have written books about how that they're impacted, and kids can talk about that. And there's lots of stories written about that. So that's mainly my experience and my take on how I've interacted with Asian American students. And so I wanted to ask you all a question. If you've witnessed any Asian American students with issues like this, or if other problems you've seen that I haven't talked about, just curious.
Does anyone want to share? I can definitely.
Oh, I mean, I could share. I mean, now that I work in a predominantly Hispanic school currently. but we actually do have two families that are mixed, Asian and Hispanic. And now that you think about it, I had them in my service club. And when we were introducing ourselves, the girls introduced themselves as Latinas, which I thought was very interesting. And then one girl did speak up and say, "Well, I thought your mom is from Vietnam." And she's like, "Oh, yeah." But I think now that you mention it, it's like she was trying to assimilate to the rest of the school culture, which is predominantly Latino, that she was denying or not sharing the other side of her mom, like her mom's side. And I do have another little boy who's half Puerto Rican and half Korean,
Mm.
proud. And he did say, it's like, oh, he shares and he says like right away, like, oh, this is where I'm from. And I think kids just kind of like are like shocked to hear it because again, we're very like Latinos, and they're like they didn't expect to have that mixture in our school. But now that you say, like, I feel like I don't know if our school does enough to acknowledge the cultures within our school because we don't only just have Mexican, we have Puerto Rican, we have a lot of Santo Domingo families or Dominican Republican families. That is something that I do see that even within our school, within Latinos, is something that we don't really foster. Uh,
Mm.
all these other cultures within our school, we always kind of like go with the flow and like, oh, everyone's kind of similar. And that prevents other kids to be proud and share, oh, I'm also this. So it's just interesting. Like I didn't think of them not sharing that aspect of their families.
Yeah, that thank you so much for sharing that. That's reminding me of a story of a woman I know. She's Korean American, and she grew up in a predominantly Black community in Atlanta, outside of Atlanta, and she had a similar experience as me, but from a Black perspective. So, yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that, and it's also making me think about not only to highlight those students with those backgrounds, but in general teaching about all of the different cultures of our country, and so that people know what's outside of our communities. Because I know that in San Francisco there's like a huge Asian population in schools, and people worry sometimes that they're only gonna that they'll be so shocked when they leave San Francisco and see like all the other cultures outside of this community. And so yeah, it's important to not only like learn about all those marginalized cultures within our schools, but then in general just to teach about it because it's part of our country. So thank you.
Yeah, and like I mean, I'm sure you know this because we're living in Chicago, but Chicago is very segregated.
Yes.
So just in general, like I wasn't even aware of other, ethnic groups because I grew up in a predominantly Mexican community until I got to high school, and it was even more so until I went to college. So
Right.
it's pretty Chicago's like intense in how
Yeah.
segregated they are.
Yeah, I remember that so well, and just all of the history around it. It's horrible. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing.
Mhm. Yeah, I would share my daughter's half Filipina, and a lot of the time she just blends in as a white kid at this school and isn't recognized as a biracial kid. And I think one time her teacher read a book and the character was Filipina in the book. The book's called Hello Universe. And I just saw her light up, like that she was
Aw.
being represented in just a very subtle way, like that she felt like special and recognized for who she truly was. And I think that's really important, that we share other people's stories. And you're right, like, okay, it's not a direct form of racism to ignore it, but it's that subtle message of white supremacy, right? That our kids get. And when my daughter finally sees just a little hint of her culture and background, she can feel a sense of pride and feel like, hey, you're talking about me, and then I'm more comfortable talking about me and who I am. So I definitely see that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, that's a wonderful story. Wow. Yeah, I wish I had that. I had zero. I only knew about, cultural holidays through my parents because they forced us to celebrate them, but otherwise there was nothing outside of my family, and so I didn't see it as cool enough
Mhm.
to, you know about. Yeah.
And you talk about the kind of trauma response, and I think we talk about fight or flight, and we say fight, flight, freeze, but there's also that that other element that's appease, right?
Mhm.
That we're starting to recognize that a way of surviving oppression or trauma is to appease.
Yeah.
And I think I lived in Thailand for 3 years, and that Southeast Asian community is deeply impacted by colonization. And they talk about in their history like that they, in order to survive not being colonized in Thailand, they forcibly adopted Western methods and banned the way of they banned Thai music. They told you
Oh,
you couldn't eat with
wow.
your hands anymore in order to stop themselves from getting colonized. And they were the only nation not to be colonized in Southeast Asia. And they did it because they built buildings that looked like European buildings. So they went to that like deep
Wow.
assimilation, like you talked about. So
Oh, I didn't know that about the history of Thailand. Yeah, I knew that they weren't colonized. Well, I know England was there for a little while, but yeah, and I know Japan did that too. They after they were invaded by Europeans, they wanted to westernize as much as possible so that they, you know, wouldn't it wouldn't happen again. So
so
yeah,
you bringing up your story of like deeply suppressing who you are in order to not be a target, I think
right.
is a big part of the history of Asia. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, and it is, and it's it's sad when I still see it, within family members where when I talk to them about my work, they just completely go silent. They don't know how to interact with me, so and they don't want to. And so it's just sad because you just kind of have like a loss of a part of yourself. You just
Mhm.
yeah, like kind of empty.
Thank you.
Great.
Do other people want to share in response to Frida's question or ask questions? Do people see like Asian American stories being represented in the curriculum at all? Can you think of any examples of like books or holidays? It's,
Share in Oakland Unified, there is a Asian Pacific Islander equity um, focus. It's mostly in high school and secondary. Um, Last year, the budget cuts threatened the department, and the showing of the Asian Pacific Islander community at the board meetings, it was beautiful. They would come dressed in, you know, beautiful attire from where they were from. They brought drums, they celebrated, they even shut down a board meeting and conducted it in circle.
mm,
So that was cool, and that's a place where the secondary students can gather, and it is improving their graduation rates. I'm curious about elementary students, which is mostly where I'm focused, and your comment about truancy in some of those Southeast Asian communities is something that I see, and I'm curious how to better work with that. Parents that are coming in from really impacted with that historical trauma of war and having to flee their countries, how we deal with that. I don't think we're doing a good job right now. So thank you for saying that.
Oh wow, thank you. Yeah, and that's interesting to hear that it's still not being addressed. I was because when I was teaching those students, it was in the late '90s, so it's just interesting how there's always something to improve on. And even in the Bay Area, where I see it as this mecca of like Asian American communities, but it's always so troubling to see like how do we address these issues.
There's a lot more support for newcomer families, and there are social workers and programs directed at that and offering support. So I think that's for sure one way with newcomer families,
Right.
that support is there. But
Yeah.
I don't know, it still feels like somewhat of a gap.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think that's why right now the ethnic studies movement, I know in California and other states, is so huge because, I mean, not only is it for a way for other people to understand people of other cultural backgrounds, but it's a way for people of those cultural backgrounds to see themselves. And, you know, I've seen statistics that I can't remember right now that show how it's really helped kids improve their schooling and want to go to school because they're learning about their communities and they feel like they're part of the country and they're part of the community and they're not alienated. Um, because I feel like I feel like that's part of the experience when you don't feel, you know, like with me, I don't feel like I belong, and so I just suppressed everything. And I think there are kids out there who know that they're different, and people let them know that they're different, and they can't assimilate because there are Asian American kids who they're not assimilable, you know, because of the certain traits that they have. You know, I'm more fair skinned, so I can kind of blend in or whatever. But there are some that can't. And so if you can't, then you're just going to completely withdraw and exclude. Um, and I think that might be part of it too, is that sort of reaction from students who aren't getting that support. Well, then I don't want to be part of this system. My family is with the gang, or my family is with my friends that are hanging out over here instead of at school. Um, yeah, but thank you for bringing that up.
I think the belongingness, right? That you want to feel you belong in a school.
Yeah, yeah. And I had some other examples. Another example of a student, actually, a Filipino student that I taught in Chicago, and he told me this really interesting story about how, you know, he spoke perfect English when I met him, and he was very activist minded. He was really cool. But when he was a little kid, he couldn't speak English perfectly. And so the school put him in a special ed program. And it took a few years, yeah, to finally realize, oh, it was the language barrier. It wasn't because he had a learning disability. And so I feel like, again, I don't know statistics, and I'm sure there are people who have written about it, and I'm sure there's some sort of trend around this where, you know, language differences can get Asian Americans placed in the wrong, you know, classes, and so where they're not being served properly. So that was an interesting story from him. That was a while ago, but yeah. And then I also had another question, because it's based on your chart, Emily, about the systems, the principles of trauma, because I felt like my presentation really dealt with that, the historical and cultural issues. So I don't know.
I can pop it up for a sec.
Yeah, if we wanted to address that question through what we're talking about, like the last question, like how do we address systems of oppression and inequity in a way that empowers individuals who have been impacted by them?
Yeah, it's a big question.
So yeah, in terms of this Asian American lens that we're looking through, I'm just curious if any of you have ideas or thoughts around that. Or I can give you my ideas. I don't know yet.
We'll give people a second because it's a big question. So
it's a huge question. Yeah.
Like, how do we empower people who are impacted by these policies in a way that that gives them a voice?
And I think we talked a lot about it already, about validating them by teaching about their cultures.
Other ways. Do we see examples of children's experiences being brought into the classroom or being celebrated in ways?
Yeah, and I think like something else is building community. So not only just talking about them in the curriculum, which, you know, is an important part, but giving students an outlet, a place where they can talk about their experiences, or where they can share, you know, kind of like what, I can't remember your name, from Chicago, Lucia.
Mhm.
Okay, sorry. Was mentioning about how, you know, you'd have events where you allow students to even just talk about themselves. Yeah, and maybe like clubs or organizations that allow students to really kind of just riff about themselves. Um, yeah, and even if it's not in an organization, I think as a teacher too, what I always tried to do was, I mean, that was a big part of my teaching strategy, was to ask students their opinions about things. So a lot of my leading questions in classes would always be about, like, what would you do if, like, how do you feel about, to really have them be engaged and part of the learning process. And I think a lot of the students really appreciated that. And that's why students would come to class sometimes, even though I still had a lot of truant kids, was because they got to speak about things that are in their lives. And then how do we tie it to history or whatever?
Mhm.
So,
Think also bringing more diversity, like where I'm in Southern Oregon, and it's pretty rural and it's predominantly white. So I think that pulling in community members and individuals, like even getting creative. So like doing a Zoom or a Skype meeting, say with a teacher from, you know, the Bay Area, like, you know, you, for example, at least for myself, thinking outside of the box and trying to get more diversity in the adults that my students interact with is huge. And so, like, if I can't find a resource at the local university, then just really trying to get creative and do
uh-huh.
better about bringing in more diversity for all of the students.
Yeah, well, that's great. Yeah, and I remember when, because Lake Forest, even though there was some diversity, it was predominantly white, and it was such a secluded area. And so what I did was I brought in people from Chicago to come speak at, you know, like I had a Native American storyteller do an event after school. I had groups from Chicago come in and speak during the assembly, just to kind of, yeah, to have something else in the school environment, you know, some sort of diverse element. Yeah, so that, and I think it's so great that we have more technology these days so that you can do things like Skype and video, and that you don't have to drag a person all the way up there if it's too far. And I know you're like rural Oregon, so that can be difficult or challenging. But yeah,
We did have some great play, like in this town. We had the Oregon Shakespeare Festival last year. Their top play was Cambodian Rock Band, which was just incredible.
wow,
Yeah, I wish you had come up and seen it, Frida. It was
wow,
amazing.
that's cool.
Yeah, it was the most wonderful play about. It was partially the history of genocide, but it was also celebrating Cambodian music, and interspersed between the actors acting and playing in a rock band. It was
Oh, wow.
phenomenal. So we're fortunate to have that, the Shakespeare Festival here bringing a lot of great, rich cultural experiences, but not everybody gets to have those, like that's still,
Yeah,
it's a privileged thing to go to those plays and stuff, but
right.
people are part of our community that are participating in that. And my ex-husband is Filipino, so everybody would stop him on the street and think he was part of the play constantly, because that is a small town where there's very few Asian people, so they always wanted his autograph.
You're famous.
Yeah. But, so I think there are some resources, but yeah, you're right. It's like reaching out and knowing why it's so important.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you want to share a little bit about Yuri and what
Yeah.
you're working on and what you're
Yeah, sure. That was the last thing that I was going to talk about. So thank you for highlighting that. So all of my experiences in education, it just sort of led me here. I always knew that I wanted to do curriculum development, like if I could leave teaching, because I got burned out, as I'm sure you understand that. And so yeah, I decided to start Yuri because when I was a teacher, a history teacher, I tried to integrate Asian American history and other histories too, of marginalized histories, and it was so difficult because I would do it. I would go to the library, I'd read the books, I'd copy and paste and photocopy and create my own textbooks essentially so that people could learn about these experiences. And you know, it worked, it was okay, but I mean I got burned out. And so I just feel like teachers really need these resources. And I know with a lot of the Asian American experience, there are resources out there, but they're so scattered everywhere. And you know, I worked in a nonprofit, so I know, I saw that firsthand. Like every organization has their own curriculum. There's some curriculum with, you know, rethinking schools. There's some with teaching for change, etc., whatever. And it's everywhere. And so I wanted to start a business where you could create a hub for these materials, to have teachers be part of the process, and then also to create teaching strategies and teaching strategies and activities that I could bring to schools through professional learning workshops, to really show schools like this is how you could teach about the Asian American experience. Here's like an Asian American Studies 101. And you know, and it could be tailored to whatever the school would like in terms of their issues. Or I have a very basic general workshop that I could bring in as well. So professional learning is a big part of my business. And I also do youth workshops where I work with youth to try and like understand identity issues in particular and with the Asian American experience, and to help them become, you know, stand more proud in their own identities as well. So yeah, and it's just starting out, but there's a lot of development going on and a lot of things, yeah, I'm working on. Like educational travel tours is something that I hope to get going as well, because I used to do that. You know, take people around to different historic sites of history, of, you know, cultural history. So yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Would you share some resources with us, Freda?
Yeah. There's one that's really great that's free and online, which of course is awesome. And it's called the Asian American Racial Justice Toolkit. And actually it was created by about 12 Bay Area organizations. And it's free, it's online, Asian American Racial Justice Toolkit. I think it's this giant PDF, many pages, and it really goes through all of the different issues. It talks about model minority, it talks about, you know, refugee experience, history, oppression, all sorts of things, with lesson plans and activities there. So I think that's a huge one. And then trying to think that's good for schools. There's another one called, I have it in front of me. Teaching about Asian Pacific Americans. And this I got from Teaching for Change, the organization.
Mm-hmm.
So I can also put that in the chat as well, and you can buy it from them. So this is a pretty good one. It has activities for students, it has community activities, and it has a lot of readings for just like education for yourself even, you know, like I learned a lot of things from here too. So it's a good mixture of different like different types of learnings and modalities. Yeah, so those are two big ones that I can think of. The Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. This is great because if you're looking to bring in things into your classroom, because they basically are a digital museum, like an online museum, because they don't have a physical space museum, but they're part of the Smithsonian, they're in DC, but they create all sorts of online experiences to talk about intersectionality between different cultures, with, you know, within Asian American, outside of Asian American, with other people of color, with whites, with whoever, to talk about different sorts of experiences, mainly like art and music focused and so on. So that could be a great resource. They have videos and things like that. And again, that's the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. And actually, I'm working with the Smithsonian this spring to talk about what is a resource we can create for teachers to bring to their schools, like an Asian American resource. So I'm going to be working on that so that I can give you more resources. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
It's
Okay.
been such an enlightening discussion. I want to see if anyone has any additional questions for Freda.
I totally appreciate the information you shared. I'm not familiar with Yuri, so what does that stand for?
Oh, what does it stand for? Yeah. So hold on, I'm just typing in this book. Yeah. So Yuri is the first name of this activist from the 60s, Yuri Kochiyama. And she had a great experience, and I want to develop a workshop actually based on her identity, her coming into her identity, because she was imprisoned during World War II with her family, and that basically activated her to do all sorts of social justice work. And she worked with all sorts of different communities, with the Puerto Rican community, like independence movement. She worked with the Black Power movement. She worked with labor organizations, Asian American studies. A most famous photo, you can look this up, is when she's the Asian American that was holding Malcolm X's head when he was shot.
Oh,
So if you look up the photo
yeah.
of Malcolm X dead on the ground, that is her, because she met him. He was talking somewhere, and she just inserted herself, and she said, "I need to know you. I need to talk to you." And so they became friends, and they worked together a bit. And she also worked with other Black Power movement activists as well. And so she lived in Harlem. Her family was there. And I'm hoping to do a walking tour there too in New York, a digital one as well. So that's in the works. We're trying to get a grant to do a digital walking tour of Yuri Kochiyama's life, and with Harlem up there. So yeah, she is this huge figure in the Asian American community, as this leading activist voice, and she was such an inspiration to me when I first learned about her in college. And in fact, she wrote us a note when we were doing our hunger strike, saying, a note of support. And I was just I wish I still had that note. I don't know where it is. But I was just so happy. I was like, oh my God. And there's all these different documentaries about her. The one that's the most interesting to me is, it's called Honk If You Love Buddha. And so it shows her going to all these different sites across the US in her travels, and just talking about her experience being an activist. Yeah, so thank you for asking that. I should have told you about that.
Yeah. And I appreciate that ending, Freda, that, and I know that's a lot of the work that you do, is that sometimes in our efforts to teach about cultures, we really compartmentalize and see them as like everything is disconnected, when, when people are working together, for equity, and highlighting that it's not at all that collaboration.
Yeah, and that's a big part of what I want to do in my business. I'm just putting this documentary down. It is that I want to show the coalition building between communities, because that is what, and especially right now in this country, it's all about division. And that's something that's so passionate for me, is that, I'm a history teacher, so I learn about this stuff. And there's so many coalitions in history between all sorts of groups, between Mexicans and Japanese, between Mexicans and Filipinos for the farm worker movements in California, between the Irish and the Mexicans, but I mean, that's literally in Mexico, but there's so much of that history. And I feel like we don't talk about that enough. And Asian Americans, I've read from my reading, they're really known to be the coalition builders in the civil rights movement. And they had a huge impact on the civil rights movement. And that's another marginalized story that's not talked about, that I really want to highlight. Because they're the ones that are always connecting, because even though assimilation can be seen as this really negative thing, it's also a positive in the sense that we're good at connecting and trying to see other people's perspective, because we're so good at being this mover, kind of like chameleon or something. And so I think that's a huge asset to the community. And there's so many stories out there. And so I really hope to get that going, and I'll let you know and all of that when I have that. Yeah.
Wonderful.
And and here's my website also that I'm putting up if you want to keep in touch with me. Yeah. So, and I'd love to hear any feedback you have, anything that you need at your schools that you look for in terms of resourcing, because we are quite new. We just sent out our first newsletter. So if you want that, you can sign up, and I'm happy to share that with you because there's resources in there. We focused on Filipinos because we talked about Larry at Liang. So if anyone who wants that. And we just did a Twitter chat. And yeah, so yeah, I would love to have your feedback since you're all in education. And, you know, we're a national focused business. We want to impact all schooling. That's my goal.
Great.
So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Freda. This was an incredibly enlightening discussion, and your perspective was so meaningful and so needed. So thank you for.
Thank you so much for having me. I was so nervous, but you know, I feel very welcomed well by our fellow educators. So it's great.
Thank you.
Community.
All right. Yeah, so we're going to pause there. We actually have 2 cohorts that came together. So the people that started at 9, you're welcome to
that's right.
go. And then we have some others that we're going to continue a conversation about building trauma-informed schools. So thank you so much for your time, Freda.
Thank you so much. Bye. Nice meeting you all. Bye-bye.